Welcome everybody to Iowa Swine Day 2018, and also welcome to concurrent session 4, What's New in Research at Iowa State University. I'm Jake Seibert. I'm currently finishing up my PhD with Dr. Ross and Dr. Baumgard in animal science.
And I'm Carson DeMille, and I'm a PhD student with Dr. Nick Gabler. And before we get started, they wanted us to let you know that there's a benefit auction for Landon Martin, who is the son of Bryce and Valerie Martin. And Bryce was a former graduate student in animal science. And their 12-year-old son, Landon, was diagnosed with an aggressive form of a brain tumor in March. The benefit auction will be held on July 18th, 2018. And if you want more information, you can see me at the break or after this session, or you can contact Dr. Ken Stalder.
So again, thank you all the sponsors for helping make this day go on. And then also, I'm supposed to encourage you all to provide feedback from today and suggestions for next year by either speaking with me, Jason, or Dr. Patience. So without further ado, the first speaker for this session is my PhD co-advisor, Dr. Jason Ross. Dr. Ross's areas of research include the investigation of molecular mechanisms that regulate oocyte quality, early embryonic development, and conceptus uterine interactions leading to implantation in pigs. He is also the director of the IPIC. The title of his presentation is an update on industry-wide investigation into the root causes of pelvic organ prolapse. So, Jason?
Sounds good. Thank you. I think it's going to switch over to the other microphones now. So, can you hear okay in the back? Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here and to share with you what we've been working on through the Iowa Pork Industry Center. And as you can see, there's a lot in our group that have been doing a lot of work in this area. And every time we've given a few updates, and we continue to add people on because we continue to expand our collaboration with the group. And I also just want to point out Amanda Chipman right up front, that she's a extension program specialist in the Iowa Pork Industry Center and has really been doing a great job on driving this whole project on behalf of the center, and with the support of the National Pork Board and the research dollars that they've provided to do this, and also just in coordination and collaboration with the industry. And so it is an update on a collaboration of 104 sow farms across the country. And I don't know if there's anyone in here that has a sow farm or that your sows are participating and you want to raise your hand. Thank you very much, Tom. Thanks. It is a great collaboration, and there's a lot of groups that are helping make this a successful project. And so this is just kind of the current status of it. Actually, I think we did some analysis and added in a new slide yesterday. So it's very current, and we're continuing to work on it. And 2 weeks from now, it'll be more up to date. So again, this is just kind of the original group that put together a proposal and started working on executing on this area. And there have been a lot of discussions on prolapses and pelvic organ prolapse and sow mortality and pig livability. And Chris Hostetler, with the support of the Animal Science Committee and the National Pork Board, put out a request for proposals that last October we responded to. And this group, and you can kind of just see the backgrounds there, we got together an interdisciplinary group to help craft and design an approach to better understand what might be happening, what might be some of the root causes of prolapse. So sow mortality, particularly in the area of pelvic organ prolapse, has been elevating or increasing in the last 5 to 10 years. So that's a trend that producers recognize, the National Pork Board recognize, and the industry, being as proactive as it is, has invested money now to identify where we can find areas to improve sow livability and potentially identify what some of the root causes are for pelvic organ prolapse. And that's really the issue, is that while its occurrence has been increasing steadily in small increments, but steadily increasing, there's still no good understanding of the root cause. And that's really the objective, is to help identify what some of the potential root causes may be, so that we can identify and design hypotheses that can be tested to confirm that and then work towards mitigation. So this kind of describes the timeline of this study. And so, like I said, the National Pork Board had the request for proposals back in September of 2017. And by November, late October, we turned in a submission, found out we got funded, had interviews for the Extension Program Specialist to direct this project, and Amanda started in December 18th. So very quick, rapid turnaround. In that meantime, also, we began working to identify collaborators in the industry that would work with us, and their sow farm managers could work with us to start coordinating some of the data collection that we could pull into this study. And so that began with our first farm visit in, I think it was December 19th or somewhere 18th, and started looking at how are we going to collect all this data. And by the end of the Iowa Pork Congress, we had approximately 50 farms that were committed to being on the project and started submitting data to us. And by March, we had 104 sow farms that on a weekly basis provide mortality records to us for those individual farms. And then we also will go on to, or have gone on to, 62 farms to collect additional information on individual animals and then also specific information about those sow farms. And so the goal of that overall is to not only establish a network of partners to do this project, so that one we've accomplished that. Our target was 60 to 80 sow farms, and we're right around 100. But the real crux is here at number 2 is to develop and implement this survey tool, both based on a herd level, collecting herd level data as well as individual animal data. And then we also have been working on establishing communication and network or advisory network of producers, those in allied industry, and other university faculty and staff. So, and at the end, we'll have a large data set to help push this area forward, with the end goal that we can identify areas that we can conduct hypothesis-driven research to understand the root cause of pelvic organ prolapse. So these are just examples of the type of data that's being collected. And so when we sat down as a group, that group of 10, 11 investigators, and started putting things up on the board, what are the items that could be related to herd factors or facility factors, different management strategies, animal-based measures? What are things that we should measure on an animal before they prolapse that might be indicative or predictive of their ability to, or their risk of prolapse? You know, we looked at a lot of different data. So one of the things that we do on the data is every week sow farm managers provide their mortality and prolapse information to Amanda so that we can benchmark on a weekly basis the trends that are changing throughout the country. Okay, and then we've also been doing some sample banking. So for example, every one of those 62 sow farms that we visited, we collected lactation diets. We also collected gestation diets and sent those off for different analyses. Okay, and then we've also pulled some blood samples and some fecal swabs from a couple additional farms. So this is what the data collection looks like from a mortality, from a benchmarking standpoint. So each week, the sow farm manager will provide Amanda with this information. Every sow that dies on that farm gets recorded, and one of the things that we've done is we've created a code, you know, that there's only 7 different reasons that an animal might die, right? And on our records or system, 3 of those could be related to prolapse, right? It's either a uterine prolapse, a rectal prolapse, or both. And then the other causes include, you know, ulcer, disease, unknown, and dying due to lameness. So what happens every time a sow dies on those farms, the next week we get that information, we put it into a data set that we can track all those farms. And really what that brings value to is that instead of using systems like PigNose and PigChamp and all the different databases, all those different databases have different identifiers or causes of death that different producers will utilize. So this kind of puts it all in the same language across different systems, whether it's independents, larger groups, so that we're communicating about mortalities that are happening in the same language. So there's 104 farms. 85 of those farms are owned by 13 larger systems, and then there's also 19 independent farms that we really collaborated with Ron Ketchum and Valerie Duttlinger with SMS, and they helped us identify some good independent producers that would be really beneficial to the study as well. So there's almost 400,000 sows represented by the production systems that are involved with the study across 15 states. The other thing I'll say is that not all of them have severe prolapse issues, and so, you know, it was easy to talk to someone that's having issues with prolapse. They're willing to participate in the study to help find the solution, right? But I think it speaks to the industry that so many farms that weren't having severe issues with prolapses are also willing to participate in the study, because that's a critical component of the study being successful, is having that variation across the industry that's happening. So some of the individual animal measurements out of those 62 farms, Amanda did the vast majority, and then a couple others of us, Colin Johnson, who's also with Iowa State Extension, and then Chris Rademacher and myself made a few visits as well. But we collected information on individual sows and farrowing prior to gestation. We measured tail length. We measured a perineal score. That's a scoring system that we designed based on some images that Jamie Studer, a student at Iowa State, had collected during an internship, to really help identify prior to farrowing what are potential risks, and can you identify animals with greater risk before they go into farrowing. And so on those 62 farms, we took measurements on approximately 5,000 sows, and we made it into 11 of the 15 states that covered the study. So this is just a little bit, you know, we could spend hours, and we did. We spent dozens of hours talking about how to collect the data, what are the right measurements. And this is just one example I'll go through with the perineal scoring system that we designed. And so what we would do is go into late gestation, or even just after the farrowing room had been loaded, prior to any pigs being born, and we would assess the perineal region on those sows. And so this would be a score of what we would call a 1, right? So there's presumed little to no risk of a uterine prolapse. There's not a lot of swelling, but the sow is definitely pregnant and close to farrowing, right? So this is a same stage of gestation sow, except we would call this a 2 and suggest that there's maybe moderate to risk of prolapse, where you can see kind of some additional swelling in the vulva area, additional protrusion of the rectal area, and just kind of an overall larger perineal swelling. The score 3, right? So this, you can see just major swelling in the rectal area, very severe swelling in the vulva area, and collectively we would consider that to be a higher risk of prolapse. So we scored those animals. Some of them, we found that some of them were standing when we scored them, some of them were laying down. We found out you need to score them when they're laying down. That was one of the things we figured out during this project, during the execution of the project. So feed sample analysis. So we also took feed, ran proximate analysis, particle size. We plan to do a mycotoxin evaluation on that. We're continuing to collect information on each of those farms, right? So it's a big job to pull all that information into one Excel spreadsheet file, right? So there's a lot of information that's still coming in from those farms, such as historical production data, some of the formulations that they're using in their diets, to be able to kind of get a comprehensive view, right? So what's the ingredient source on some of the different things that are in the diet as well. So taking a little bit of time to make sure we get all that information that we can, and also to make sure that information is accurate. The K-means clustering is another strategy we've begun using with Dr. Daniel Linares and Gustavo Silva, to look at how can we evaluate this data and identify trends in prolapses across the different farms, so we can start grouping them based on their mortality related to prolapse. We also have done some laboratory analysis and are continuing to do additional lab analysis on serum samples and some of the vaginal swabs and fecal swabs. We're continuing to collect weekly prolapse data and mortality data, and would like to work towards developing a less subjective scoring system on the perineal score. So what I'm getting ready to show you is kind of our initial analysis of where the data is looking right. So some of it's just characterization of the data, and what we will show you is the initial analysis, but we still need to do a lot of work to really identify and make sure that we're including the right covariables into the model. So this is kind of like the Steve Myers slide that said, if you do anything based on what I tell you today, I'm not liable. So my advice is just not to go jumping to conclusions based on anything that I say today. So So we will continue to dig into the model that we're going to use and look at it different ways to make sure that the results and what we publish in a final report based on this study that we feel very confident in. So this is just the trends, right? So let's look at what's happening with annualized pelvic organ prolapse rate for the 104 farms. So if you were to take the average from those farms over the weeks 6 to 23 of this calendar year, there are farms that are one farm above 10%, but there are quite a few farms that 4 to 8% of their mortality is occurring due to pelvic organ prolapse. There's also quite a few farms down here that less than 1% of their annualized mortality occurs as a result of pelvic organ prolapse. So every one of those farms that sends in their data to Amanda, they all have a unique identifier. You can't read it from the back there anyway, but these are all unique IDs, so you can't figure out which one goes with which farm. But then that goes into a report that gets submitted back out to everybody that's participating in the study, as well as some others, just to kind of keep an idea and a pulse on the benchmarking that's happening. So this is overall mortality. If you were to take the average for all the farms kind of over time from February 4th through the beginning of June so far, this is kind of just what the industry trends on mortality have been for the farms that are in our study. So, roughly anywhere from, on a week-to-week basis, 11 to 13% on an annualized basis. And if you look at just those deaths that are occurring due to pelvic organ prolapse, that's running anywhere from 3.5% to a little over 2%. So you start to see a little bit of a downward trend, and what I'll show you in a little bit is it's the farms really that are most severely affected by pelvic organ prolapse are the ones that tend to have more of a seasonal effect on it. So when the earlier months in the calendar year are harder on farms that have an overall higher average. So this is kind of the breakdown of mortality. So what we see here is a pie chart that's developed. This is the culmination of all that data from week 4 through week 23 over here, so June 3rd-ish. And so this is kind of the breakdown. Right now, from the farms on this study, what this would suggest is that here in the blue is uterine prolapse, 5% would be rectal or anal prolapse, and 2% are dying because of both, right? So collectively, 23% of the mortalities that are happening in the industry in the period of time on these farms are related to pelvic organ prolapse. So if you were to extrapolate that across the entire industry and say, okay, well, what's that mean for an inventory of 6 million sows? It's about a 4,000 sow farm a week that we would lose production on as a result of pelvic organ prolapse. So there's a good reason to pursue this and a good reason to try to identify those root causes to develop the appropriate mitigation strategies. And then you'd also see that 38% would fall into the category of unknown and 28% related to lameness. So there's a lot of variation, right? You saw some of that variation in those bar charts. This is just one way of looking at that data. And what we did here is we took, okay, well, what were the 20% of the farms, so about 21 of the farms that had the lowest mortality, the best mortality numbers. What are the average farms, so those middle 63 farms, 62, 63 farms, and then the farms that had the highest or the worst mortality. And just look at their trends over time. And so they got classified into those categories based on, so far, their 2018 data, right? But when you look at them as a group, what you would see is that the higher ones run around 15 to 20% annualized mortality. The average is still around 13%, which is consistent with that number I showed you before. But then the best farms with respect to sow survivability and minimizing mortality runs around 7% on an annualized basis. When you look at the same thing in those same categories, but break them into the categories based on pelvic organ prolapse, what you see is that the farms that are doing really well with respect to minimizing pelvic organ prolapse, and it's not that they're really doing anything, it's just that's what the numbers are showing, right? That's part of the project, is to figure out what they are doing. They're running around 1% annualized pelvic organ prolapse. The average is around 3%. And those 10 or 20 farms that are most severely affected run around 7-8% at the beginning of the year, but have drifted down to about 4% now. So you see more of a downward trend or a seasonality effect on those farms that are most severely affected. This is another strategy to take all that information to try and extrapolate what it means and improve our understanding, and how do we classify a farm based on whether it's doing really well or struggling. And one of the ways to classify those farms is based on the trends. So the first way we broke farms into buckets was looking at them based on their overall average. And so what Doctors Linares and Silva did with the data here was look at it from the standpoint of looking at the weekly trends that change each week for each farm. How can we use an algorithm to predict which cluster that farm should be in based on the trends that happen over the first 18 weeks that we've been collecting data on this study? And so really what we end up with is that the farms break into essentially 3 clusters. So what you can see over here is there's a blue, green, and red, or 1, 2, and 3 clusters, that those are based on individual farms' weekly trends, and that's why they find those clusters. And so then we can look back and say, okay, well, cluster 1 represents 49% of the farms, and they have an average pelvic organ prolapse incidence per 1,000 sows of 0.29. Okay, and so then there's cluster 2 has 36 farms, and cluster 3, those more severely affected ones, have 9 farms, but they average 1.58 prolapses per 1,000 sows per week. And so what this will enable us to do, right, is to go back and take all those other measurements that we've collected and say, how do the farms that are in cluster 3 compare to the farms that are in cluster 1 based on the data that we've collected? And so that's kind of where we're at with this the statistical approach. So when you look at those clusters and map those farms based on their cluster that they're in, you can kind of see, there's a lot of variation from week to week, and that's part of the advantage of using that analysis approach, is that it takes part of that variation out, right? So if you have one bad week, it doesn't mean that farm is now considered a high incidence farm, right? So, so this blue line shows the average trends for each of those clusters, okay? And it kind of comes back to the other way of looking at it. This is a more precise approach to classifying farms into specific groups as well. So those are 2 approaches that we can classify farms based on mortality and based on pelvic organ prolapse that we're working on. So, and the lines are kind of faint on this chart here, but this really just shows those 3 clusters in a larger chart compared to each other, looking at their pelvic organ incidence rate per 1,000 sows per week. So over the project period. So again, our interest is what are the differences on the farms that are in these clusters compared to these clusters, and really compared to this cluster 3. So, right, what are the things that we can identify that are statistically different that could represent areas of investigation that we can go and use a hypothesis-driven study to test those differences and then develop a mitigation plan. So some of the other things that we've looked at, so these are just some correlations that we've run, and if you look at annualized pelvic organ prolapse incidence here on this chart plotted against annualized total mortality, what you would see is that there's a pretty strong correlation. So an R-square of 0.38 would suggest that about 38% of the variation in annualized mortality can be explained by annualized prolapse mortality. And if you look over here, this is a nice way of looking at it as well, is that when you compare non-pelvic organ prolapse mortalities, right? So those that die for other reasons, and plot that against the annualized pelvic organ prolapse rate for all those individual farms, you see that the correlation is much weaker. That only explains about 2%, suggesting that the animals that are dying due to prolapse is independent of the other reasons that they're dying for on the farm. So it's not just that if you have more lameness, you're likely to have more prolapses. So this is kind of using that perineal scoring system. We also did measure body condition scores on each of the sows that we looked at on the farms. And so this would just take on those farms. So again, each one of these dots looks at individual farms, and we would say, well, what's the average perineal score for the week that we were on that farm, and plot that against their average incidence rate of prolapse. And what you see is about 16% of the variation is explained by the perineal score. So there's an association between farms that have a lot of those sows that have a high perineal score, also likely having a higher rate of pelvic organ prolapse whereas we did not see the same relationship with body condition score on a whole herd basis. So this is another thing we looked at. Boy, we measured a lot of tails. Amanda measured a lot of tails, about 5,000 of them. So, and what we can tell you is that when you plot the average tail length for a farm, right? So when you, and there's a lot of variation, right? Some farms over here average 2.5 centimeters. Other farms over here average 10 centimeters for the average tail length of the sows of that farm, and you plot it against their incidence rate for prolapse, and it explains almost none of the variation in prolapse, okay? So, I've promised Amanda we will not measure any more tails. There's other things that we'll focus on. So we also measured, right, there you see a little bit, but also a really weak correlation between this rectum to vulva distance as well. That was just another physiological indicator. Is there something that we can measure on the sows that would increase, represent an increased risk? One of the questions, right, when we were having those discussions is involving around induction of sows. And so there's a lot of different strategies across the industry. In fact, you walk in and you ask a sow farm manager, you know, what percentage of sows would you say that you induce? Some of them are very aggressive and will induce everything after 114 days, so they would tell you a lot of them. Some would say we don't induce anything ever. It'll farrow when it needs to, and then others have different strategies. And then, so the ones that do kind of use a strategy in between, we'd ask them, well, how many do you think you induce? And they say, probably about 15% or whatever. So then we would go down and walk through the farrowing room and look at about 100 or 50 to 100 sow cards and write down how many of them got induced. And it would be, 30%, right? So we went into and looked at different farms, read the cards and said, well, what's the snapshot in time for that farm on their induction strategy? And so if you went to a farm, and really what we see here is that farms that induce 0% of their sows compared to farms anywhere on this spectrum, there's not really a relationship between induction strategies used by that farm and the pelvic organ prolapse rate that's observed on those farms. The same thing's true also on the sleeving strategies, right? So the same thing for farms that are very aggressive on sleeving, and some farms will really minimize their efforts in sleeving sows. So we read a lot of sow cards and collected that information and plotted against the percentage of sows that were never sleeved during the course of that farrowing, and also those that were sleeved 3 or more times, the percent on that farm that have that happen. So you can see over here that there's some sow farms, right? Are very aggressive. More than half of the sows will get sleeved more than 3 times. And there's other ones over here that, many of the sows are never sleeved, right? So 80% are never sleeved. So it's just, there's a lot of variation of that, but when you look at that management strategy, both of those, and plot that against the incidence rate of prolapse, we do not see a relationship between those. This was an interesting analysis that we had run. And what we were looking at was, so we collect a lot of information about the structure of the farm, the facilities, the pen size, all that information. And included in that is whether or not they're using a water treatment strategy on that farm. So do they treat the water? This doesn't include the source of the water. This is just, is the water treated? And so 21 farms had water treatment involved in that sow farm, and 74 did not. And so we used the weekly data for each of the farms as a repeated measure statement in that analysis, and found that there was a very significant statistical effect of using water treatment on the incidence of pelvic organ prolapse. So, in just comparing using farm as the experimental unit. And so when you extrapolate that out, that difference of incidence rate per week, that's about 1.3, 1.4% mortality. So that's something, right? That's something that was one of the objectives, right? Identify these things that cause you to say, okay, that's something we should dig into a little bit more and look at with a little more intensity to figure out why. And right, it may not be that water treatment is not the root cause or lack of water treatment of why a prolapse happens, but this helps us understand what are some of the things that could be affected by water treatment that we should be looking at from a biological perspective. And so if you take that same data, right, and just plot in the yellow bars those farms that have water treatment happening, those 21 farms, and compare it to the 74 that do not, right, this is the weekly data on pelvic organ prolapse. And you can see every single week those farms that have the treatment are a little bit lower. And then also when you plot it just on mortality in general, they're typically lower mortality rates on farms that have water treatment. So that's the initial analysis, right? We've got to go back and say, okay, are there factors that are confounding variables in this data set too, and make sure we use the right covariates to have a more comprehensive analysis. But that's kind of what the first look at that looks like. Another thing we looked at was the bump feeding strategy, right? So there's different folks do that different ways. This was just really the strategy, or our analysis here was what's the effect of these 13 farms that their approach is to bump feed just the lower body condition scores. These farms here, just the entire farm is going to get bump fed before they go into farrowing and no bump feeding. And so what we saw is that there tended to be some differences there as well, right, depending on that strategy. This is another one of those items, though, that some systems have one strategy and it's used on the entire system. So this analysis could be confounded by other factors that are whole system approaches, right? So, but there's also some groups that have within different sow farms will use different approaches even within the same system. So that's all part of what we're trying to work out with the analysis. With respect to the individual animal data, again, we use the scoring system, and what we can see here, right, at the scores 1, 2, 3s across the whole study, that sows that score a 1 or a 2 prior to going into or a few days before farrowing have about 1% of those will subsequently prolapse, but if you score a 3, you have about a 700% increased risk of ultimately prolapsing. So again, that's something that we can go back onto a sow farm and identify, here's a risk factor that we can see before it happens so that we can collect additional information on those animals and maybe samples from those animals to include into future studies. So, we also looked at the relationship between those perineal scores and body condition score, and we really didn't see a strong relationship there. So the rectum to vulva distance, basically just based on which perineal score group that those animals would fit into, is there a relationship between body condition and rectum to vulva, and we didn't really see that. What we did see, though, is that when we did the body condition scoring, it appears that those that scored a body condition score of 1 compared to a 2 or 3, almost twice as many of those will ultimately prolapse compared to of the thinner sows. And so, again, right, one way of interpreting that is that the lower body condition score would cause a prolapse. And I don't think that's necessarily the right way to interpret that information. When you think about it in more detail, what's causing prolapse is lower body condition score, a side effect of that. So it's a co-observation that we see, not necessarily causality. And then further, when you break it down by body condition score and perineal score, you can kind of see the risk factors on those individual animals. So the thinner animals that have a high perineal score are going to be at the greatest risk. Those animals going into farrowing at the greatest risk of ultimately prolapsing. So really thin, in a 3, about 9.7 to 7% of those will ultimately prolapse. So we've also, as I mentioned before, Zoe Kiefer in our group went to a couple of the farms and with Amanda collected vaginal swabs from animals that were scored a 1, 2, or 3, and we worked with Dr. Stefan Schmitz-Estner at Iowa State and did some microfloral sequencing, right? So to look at what is the microbial population and the reproductive tract of those animals. And so we did about 88 samples and got good data from about 79 of them. And that was across 2 different farms. And what we found in our initial analysis of that is that there are different operational taxonomic units, or OTUs, that essentially indicate either a specific species of bacteria or a family of bacteria, is what would be referred to as an OTU. And so what this data suggests to is that one thing is that there's different microbial populations or vaginal microflora on different farms. And the other thing that we can take away from this at this point is that there are different microflora, vaginal microflora, in animals that score a 1 compared to a 3. And so that's, again, something that we're going to continue to dig into from trying to understand the physiology of what's happening on those scores. Another thing that Zoe has done is looking at LPS binding protein. So LPS binding protein is something that we measure in studies where we're doing heat stress experiments, and what happens during heat stress is you actually have a reduction in the integrity of the gut wall during heat stress in pigs. that increases the amount of endotoxins that get into the blood and into the circulation, and one of the body's responses is upregulation of LPS binding protein. So it's an acute phase response that happens. And so we also looked at that in those 88 animals, or about 60 of those animals, and what we saw is those that have a perineal score had about a 25% increase in the LPS binding protein content in circulation. So this is about, I think there's about 13 or 14 animals in each of these groups. So, so suggesting that maybe there's some biology happening there that with some specific markers that we can start looking at in the endocrine system. So a few things still to do. We still have a lot of work to do. Feel like we've made really good progress. If you look back to the timeline and think that we were just launching this on December 19th, we've come a long ways, but there's a lot to do. We are entering all the data. We've gotten the feed analysis back from over 124 samples, and are entering all that information into our analysis. We've also got particle size information that we've entered into our analysis. And then we're also trying to identify specific farms. Now that we have these track record of farms, we can go back and say, okay, what are the specific things that we need to evaluate, where we can start looking and collect more information and identify maybe some comparable farms across different systems and within systems that we can collect additional information or additional biological samples from. So other opportunities as we finish this initial phase one of the project up is to look at some additional endocrine disruption that's happening, genetic approaches, nutritional contributions, and the ultimate goal, again, is to design and employ those on-farm mitigation strategies and to start to turn the trend in the other direction. So there are a lot of people that contributed to this, a lot of producers. So we ask, who's willing to enable us to give them the credit and when we give a talk. And so this is a big chunk of the farms are managed by these groups, and a lot of independents that have contributed. There's also many people that have contributed that aren't up here as well. So it's been a great collaboration across the industry, and very thankful for the support of the pork producers and IPPA and National Pork Board for helping fund it. So I'll stop there and I'm happy to take a couple questions if we have time.